The Ukraine Peace Plan conference finally took place at Bergenstock Resort in Switzerland on June 15th and 16th, immediately after the G7 meeting in Italy. During the World Economic Forum in January, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky reached an agreement with the Swiss government to host a peace conference, with his 10-point peace plan serving as the conference's centerpiece. The agreement by the Swiss government, a traditional neutral power, was a significant accomplishment for Ukraine, as Switzerland was considered a natural neutral arbiter and had agreed in principle to put its weight behind the Ukraine peace process. The Swiss government's enthusiasm for this agreement began to wane due to flaws in both the peace plan and the format of the talks. The flaws surfaced in the months leading up to the conference, but with the conference just weeks away, these flaws positioned the peace organizers to defend the conference's purpose while still attempting to secure countries' participation. The format of the peace conference, which utilized the Ukraine 10-point peace plan, has two fundamental flaws. The first flaw lies in the fact that the plan was not a true peace plan, but rather a list of demands and buzzwords, with little intention of facilitating serious peace negotiations to end a war. This plan set an unattainable expectation for a country that was partially occupied and unable to eject the Russian occupiers, and it provided no basis for a true negotiation with the Russians, who unfortunately currently maintain a strong battlefield position in Ukraine. This is why the Russians have outright rejected the Ukraine plan, viewing it as a non-serious starting point for peace negotiations. The second flaw lies in not inviting the Russians or a country representing the Russian side to the peace conference. Without warring parties talking to each other or having an intermediary between two sides that cannot meet face-to-face, no serious peace conference can take place. This criticism was apparent early in the process and became directed at the Swiss government. The Swiss Foreign Ministry, with its extensive experience in such matters, should have recognized this format flaw and never consented to peace talks in the format Ukraine's president and foreign ministry proposed. The Russians and their allies have used this flaw as a point of contention to pressure countries not to attend. The Swiss and Ukrainians addressed some of the original peace conference's flaws prior to its commencement. The original 10 points of the peace plan were reduced to 3 that were more relevant to peace talks. The 3 points concerned nuclear safety, food security, and the complete return of war prisoners and Ukrainian civilians held captive by Russia. These were points from the original plan, which the Swiss and Ukrainians could at least convince the international delegation to agree to and be willing to sign a closing joint communiqué. However, the inability to address or rectify the flaw of not inviting Russia to the conference became an international point of contention, thereby diminishing the likelihood of peace. The Russians rejected the 10-point peace plan as a foundation for peace, rendering the issue unresolvable. As a result, they were unable to reconsider their decision to attend, and in terms of public relations, they had no incentive to lend credibility to a conference that amounted to little more than a media showcase for Ukraine. This is a legitimate Russian concern, as President Zelensky put significant time and effort into rallying countries to attend the peace conference, with the latest example being his appearance at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore in early June, where he tried to convince Indo-Pacific countries to attend the conference. Many countries' skepticism about the flaw in the peace format made the meeting's purpose and attendance questionable, so interest was waning. As a result, Ukraine, and to a lesser extent Switzerland, attempted to rally countries to attend a peace conference over the world's largest current war and Europe's largest land war since World War II. Ukraine, which relies on positive public relations to support its international campaign and gain support to effectively resist the Russians, would view the sparse attendance as a public relations setback. This also meant that the Russians had an interest in countering the Ukraine's attempts to rally countries by pressuring nations not to attend. In recent weeks, Russian President Vladimir Putin and the Russian Foreign Ministry have made significant efforts to draw attention to the shortcomings of the peace conference. With China's support, Russia asserted that a legitimate peace conference cannot occur without Russia's invitation, and that dialogue is the only path to lasting peace. It also stated that the conference made the situation less stable, though this was a self-fulfilling prophecy, as China and Russia attempted to divide the world by attending the peace conference. Thus, China and Russia's strategy turned peace into another contentious division of the post-invasion world order. President Zelensky, without providing proof, accused China of specifically intimidating countries not to attend when he addressed the Shangri-La dialogue. He also accused Russia of threatening countries with trade sanctions on food, chemicals, and energy to discourage attendance. This is a claim made by the Ukrainians, but there seems to be evidence suggesting that some form of coercion was being used to prevent the developing countries from participating in the peace process in Ukraine. As criticism over the peace format grew, the Swiss and Ukrainians began emphasizing that the summit in June was just an attempt to show international support for peace in Ukraine, and that future meetings would include Russia. Russia, for example, appears to be indicating that it will not be involved in any Swiss-Ukraine-sponsored peace process and is supporting China's call to hold peace talks over what it calls the 6-point peace plan. China has been lobbying for an alternative to the Ukraine plan, and it has told developing countries that the Ukraine plan would only prolong the war, so their participation would be counterproductive to peace. China, using its influence in the global south, believes that attendance only promotes bloc confrontation, which is a favorite refrain of the Chinese Foreign Ministry. It assured these countries that not attending does not mean they are against peace in Ukraine. The Chinese efforts have led to an endorsement from 45 countries and Russia for their proposal. Switzerland invited 160 countries to attend the conference, but the Russian and Chinese efforts seem to have had an impact, as only about 90 countries and organizations attended, and some of the attendees, such as India, sent relatively low-ranking officials. It was not a public relations failure for Ukraine, but it was not the participation it wanted. It wasn't a public relations win for the Russian-China partnership either, as more countries attended the Swiss summit than committed to the Chinese proposed summit. Prior to the peace summit, the Russians did not help their cause by stating that they would negotiate immediately if Ukraine withdrew all its troops from the regions in the Ukrainian Donbas that Moscow illegally annexed after the war started. This demonstrated to the world, especially in the West and non-aligned countries, that Russia was not serious about peace, or was at least more interested in undermining Switzerland's peace efforts. The Swiss conference ended with 78 countries signing a communiqué stating that Ukrainian territory is the key to any peace agreement with Russia. Most notably, India was one of a dozen predominantly developing countries that did not sign the communiqué. The unfortunate fact is that the Swiss Peace Conference, despite statements that Russia will be invited to future peace talks, is most likely a dead end. This is because Ukraine insisted on holding the conference without Russia, indicating that Russia will not view it as a neutral platform for participation. The other outcome of the China-Russia push for an alternative peace conference sponsored by China's 6-point plan is unlikely to be as successful, given that Ukraine has already rejected China's peace initiatives. This was partially a result of China snubbing Ukraine's attempts to get it to join the talks in Switzerland, but also of China's attempt to undermine Ukraine's strategy to gather support for the Swiss conference. The Chinese talks were also pressed as an alternative to the Swiss talks, so they will not be seen as a neutral format by supporters of the Swiss conference. The only positive outcome from this week is that many countries are in agreement and calling for peace. There is not a universal consensus on what peace in Ukraine will look like because the war has divided the world largely along ideological blocs, with each side favoring terms closer to what their bloc prefers. It is also unclear if there is enough impetus to start peace talks, as Russia seems willing to press its battlefield advantages for the time being. The two Swiss and Chinese proposed peace plans face significant obstacles, necessitating the need for a new venue and sponsor. The Russian proposal for the G20 to serve as a venue is likely to face rejection from Ukraine due to it being proposed by Russia. There is a consensus on the idea of peace in Ukraine, but now the world needs a party that can bring both countries together for dialogue in an acceptable format, which will be the new challenge.